January 1945. The jungle around northern Luzon carried a chilled morning mist, drifting low across patches of broken earth and abandoned positions. A faint smell of burned canvas lingered where a Japanese field station had collapsed under artillery fire the night before. Inside a shallow dugout roofed with bamboo and tarp, 3 Japanese nurses knelt beside a wounded officer whose breathing had grown thin and erratic. His uniform was torn open at the shoulder, blood-soaked bandages pressed tight by shaking hands. They whispered to him softly, trying to keep him conscious, but the dim light made every movement feel heavier. Outside, scattered rifle shots echoed somewhere in the ridgeline. The nurses thought American troops were drawing closer, and fear traveled through them, fear not only of capture but of what might happen to a wounded officer in enemy hands. Yet they kept working, exhaustion mixing with duty, unaware that what approached through the fog was not a rifle squad, but a pair of U.S. Army medics, following a trail of wounded in hopes of finding survivors. The officer's pulse faltered just as footsteps neared, pulling the story into the wider struggle unfolding across Luzon. By early 1945, the Pacific War had entered a phase of accelerating collapse for Japanese ground forces across the Philippines. After the landings on Leyte in October 1944 and the subsequent push toward Luzon, Japanese divisions found themselves cut off, and forced into a desperate defensive war against a U.S. Army advancing with overwhelming logistical strength. Medical supplies within Japanese units had dwindled to fragments. Quinine, sulfadizine, plasma, and anesthetics were almost gone. Improvised splints, reused bandages, and hand-stitched dressings defined the makeshift clinics, hidden in ridges and ravines. For Japanese nurses, many trained at military academies in Tokyo or Osaka, the reality of frontline care in 1945 looked nothing like the structured hospitals they once knew. They lived inside the same collapsed defensive pockets as infantry, moving constantly to evade shelling, and tending wounded officers who often refused evacuation. The U.S. Army, meanwhile, was operating with an entirely different doctrine. Field medics in the Pacific were trained to treat any wounded person they encountered, friend or enemy, if the tactical situation allowed. Plasma kits, morphine syrettes, sulfur powders, and sterilized dressings were part of standard equipment. Casualty evacuation routes stretched from foxholes to battalion aid stations and onward to hospital ships. Even in the chaos of Luzon's ridges, the system moved with a predictability shaped by logistics, radios, and trained personnel. Encounters between Japanese nurses and American medics were extremely rare. Most Japanese medical staff retreated deep into forests, often ordered never to surrender, while US patrols seldom approached medical shelters unless fire had come from the position. Yet the collapse of the Shobu Group's defensive lines in northern Luzon forced many medical teams into direct proximity with advancing Americans. It was in this shifting landscape of organized resistance surrounded by an army built on evacuation and care that the wounded officer's condition deteriorated beyond what the nurses could manage. The dugout lay just off a ridgeline used earlier by a U.S. reconnaissance element, which explained why 2 medics were now sweeping the area for any soldiers left behind. They had been treating casualties since dawn, moving along shell-shattered paths where both American and Japanese wounded had been found. One medic, carrying a folded plasma kit, noticed faint drag marks in the soil, a sign that someone had pulled a body or stretcher toward the trees. Those marks brought them closer to the nurses' shelter, drawing 2 very different medical worlds into contact. The nurses' anxiety deepened because their officer was not simply another casualty. He was a platoon commander from a regiment battered during the retreat from Baguio, and he had shielded several of them during the previous night's shelling. His survival carried both emotional weight and the harsh discipline of wartime expectations. Losing an officer to enemy capture carried stigma. Losing one because care failed carried shame. Their training emphasized sacrifice and unwavering loyalty, but their supplies were exhausted, and the officer's wound demanded interventions they could not perform. That contrast in medical capability formed the first angle of the encounter. For the nurses, the human burden was heavy fear of dishonor, fear of what capture meant for them, and fear of failing a man they respected. Their hands trembled, not from lack of will, but from the exhaustion of weeks spent tending wounded in conditions that offered almost no rest. Each whispered reassurance to the officer masked their growing realization that he was slipping away. The second angle was tactical. The American medics did not arrive by chance. U.S. units advancing through the ridges often sent small medical teams ahead to locate wounded from earlier fights. These medics operated with minimal weapons, relying on speed and terrain familiarity. Their mission that morning followed reports of scattered casualties near the abandoned Japanese position. They expected danger from snipers or trapped pockets of resistance, but they also knew that ignoring a wounded man regardless of nationality conflicted with everything they had been trained to do. Their approach toward the dugout was cautious, yet guided by unmistakable signs of recent movement. The third angle lay in medical capability itself. U.S. field kits of 1945 included plasma, sterile compresses, morphine, and sulfur drug stools that stabilized trauma long enough for evacuation. Japanese field teams still carried skill and dedication, but almost none of these supplies remained. Many resorted to boiling dressings, reusing needles, and stitching wounds with improvised threads. When confronted with a hemorrhaging shoulder wound and shock symptoms, the nurses knew exactly what needed to be done but lacked nearly everything required to do it. The discrepancy between knowledge and resources placed them in a position where even perfect technique could not compensate for the absence of plasma. The fourth angle involved ideology and moral expectation. Japanese nurses had been taught to expect hostility or execution if captured. Propaganda framed American troops as brutal and unrestrained. Conversely, American medics were indoctrinated with legal and moral obligations under the Geneva Principles, reinforced by commanders who valued battlefield discipline. When the nurses heard footsteps stop at the entrance of the dugout, they braced for confrontation, certain that enemy soldiers were about to seize the officer. The idea that Americans might save him instead did not exist within their expectations yet. That was exactly what was about to unfold. The turning point began the moment one medic ducked beneath the tarp and froze. As his eyes adjusted to the dim interior, 3 nurses turned toward him, hands raised instinctively, not in surrender, but in a silent plea to delay whatever they believed was coming. The other medic stepped closer, scanning the officer's shallow breaths and pale skin. He didn't reach for a weapon, he reached for the plasma kit. In that instant, tension shifted into confusion. The nurses expected commands or confiscation. Instead, they witnessed precise, confident triage assessments, delivered with no hesitation. The officer's pulse was thready, his skin cold, classic signs of hypovolemic shock. The medic prepared a plasma bottle, threading the tubing with practiced efficiency. Another medic cleaned the wound with sterile compresses, applying sulfur powder to slow bacterial spread. The nurses watched every movement, understanding the science and recognizing equipment they had not seen in months. The medics spoke softly to one another, focusing entirely on stabilizing the patient. When the plasma began to flow, color slowly returned to the officer's face, and his breathing steadied enough for a deeper inhaler, moment that caused one nurse to gasp in disbelief. The scene grew heavier as minutes passed. The nurses shifted from fear to realization. The Americans were saving him, not harming him. One nurse instinctively supported the officer's head as instructed, her training aligning seamlessly with the medic's techniques. The dugout, once a place of dread, turned briefly into a unified treatment station where former enemies worked side by side. Outside, distant artillery rumbled, but inside, the focus was singular, keeping the officer alive long enough for evacuation. When the plasma stabilized his condition, the medics signaled that he needed to be carried to an aid station. They expected the nurses to resist. Instead, they assisted with steady hands, still processing what they had witnessed. That moment created consequences that reached beyond the small dugout. After the officer was transported, reports from the aid station noted that 3 Japanese nurses arrived alongside the casualty, exhausted and stunned by the treatment they had witnessed. American personnel recorded their cooperation and their emotional reaction to the officer's survival. Similar incidents elsewhere in Luzon showed that humane treatment often encouraged surrender among isolated medical teams. The officer survived long enough to be transferred to a larger facility, where his condition improved further under extended care. For the nurses, the aftermath reshaped long-held assumptions. They later recounted the shock of seeing American medics supply life-saving care without hesitation. Their diaries and testimonies, collected after the war, describe the moment as one that challenged everything wartime propaganda had taught them. The encounter also influenced local commanders, who began noting increased willingness among medical staff to surrender rather than flee into mountains where survival was unlikely. The wider campaign continued with brutal intensity, yet small humanitarian moments left a lasting imprint in the broader scope of the Pacific War. Such events demonstrated the power of medical ethics, even amid bitter conflict. They highlighted stark differences in logistical capacity, training, and doctrine. They also revealed how individual acts of care could soften rigid ideological divides, even if only briefly. The Japanese officers' survival carried no strategic weight in the Luzon campaign, but it held deep symbolic meaning among those who witnessed it in later years. Surviving nurses reflected on that morning as proof that compassion could surface even in the harshest moments of war. They remembered the plasma bottle hanging from a bamboo beam, the steady hands of the American medic, and the transformation of fear into stunned respect. War took many things from those who lived through it, but moments like this showed that humanity could still appear through the smoke and ruin. Acts of medical mercy did not change the course of the battle for Luzon, yet they carved a lasting memory into the lives of those present, reminding them that beyond uniforms and ideology, the instinct to preserve life could still bridge the deepest divides. Thanks for watching this video.